dig into new data confirming that rural regions across the EU are getting a fraction of the R&D investment that cities receive, and ask whether the gap is a funding problem or something deeper. Plus, we look at what Kenya's mobile money boom might teach rural innovators everywhere. Stay with us. I'm Art.
I'm Jan.
And this is the Rural Innovator, a weekly look at the research, news, and projects shaping rural innovation, drawn from the library at ruralinnovations.org.
Let's start with the research side, and I want to lead with something that's genuinely foundational. Even though it's not new, this week, the library added a piece on diffusion of innovations theory, specifically the 4th edition of what's become a foundational textbook in health behavior research.
Diffusion of innovations. That's Everett Rogers territory, right? The bell curve, the early adopters, the laggards.
Exactly. And this edition synthesizes theory, research, and practical application for health professionals trying to understand how new behaviors spread through communities. But the reason I'm flagging it here is that the framework travels.
Walk me through what you mean by that. Because when I hear health behavior theory, I'm thinking clinics, not grain elevators.
Fair. But the core question Rogers is asking, why do some innovations spread quickly through a community and others don't? That's the same question rural economic developers, extension workers, and ag tech companies are wrestling with every day.
The adoption curve problem. You've got a handful of early adopters running precision ag tools, and the majority of producers are still waiting to see how it shakes out.
Right? And what the diffusion literature tells us is that the gap between early adopters and the early majority is often less about the technology and more about trust, social networks, and whether the innovation is compatible with existing practice.
Which, in a rural community, often means whether your neighbor tried it first. That peer effect is massive out here.
Massive. And that's exactly what the theory predicts. So I think this one's worth revisiting for anyone doing rural innovation work, not just health researchers.
All right, what else came in on the research side?
2 more pieces. One is very practical, a tour of rural data in Statistics Canada. It's background notes from a CRRF webinar walking through how Statistics Canada actually classifies rural geographies.
And this matters more than it sounds, because the definition of rural changes what you measure and what funding you qualify for.
Completely. Statistics Canada uses density, distance, and administrative boundaries. And those 3 criteria don't always agree with each other. A community might be rural by one definition and not by another.
Which produces this maddening situation where your town doesn't show up in the rural data, but it's also not in the urban data. You're just invisible.
Classification limbo. And the piece is a companion to Duplessis et al. From 2002, which is still one of the cleaner typologies out there. If you're doing any data work on rural Canada, this is a good orientation.
Good to flag. And the third research piece?
This one hits closer to home for a lot of communities. It's a study on sustaining a tuition support program in a rural setting, specifically looking at the challenges of keeping community-based education programs alive when resources are limited.
Published in the Journal of Rural and Community Development, if I'm reading the URL right. Brandon University?
That's right. And the study identifies the recurring pressure points: funding instability, volunteer burnout, the difficulty of demonstrating impact to funders who want clean metrics for programs that are inherently relational.
That last one is real. You can count how many students got a bursary. You can't easily count what happens to a community when more of its young people stay and complete post-secondary.
And the paper does try to offer responses, practical approaches for programs navigating those pressures. It's not just a list of problems.
That's appreciated, because the field has plenty of papers that diagnose and then just stop.
Agreed. Though I'd note the sample here is constrained to one program in rural Canada, so we should be careful about overextending the findings. The responses they identify may not translate across different provincial contexts or different kinds of programs.
Fair point. But as a practitioner case study, it's valuable. All right, let's move to the news segment. You wanted to lead with the EU data.
Yes, Science Business published a piece this week confirming what a lot of people in rural innovation have suspected for a long time, that EU research funding is heavily concentrated in cities. Rural regions receive only 12% of R&D investment, despite housing 21% of the population.
That's not a small gap. That's a structural gap. 12% of funding, 21% of the people.
And it shows up in spending intensity too. Rural areas are averaging 1.6% of GDP in R&D, compared to 2.4% in urban zones. The gap is consistent across multiple indicators.
Now, I want to push back slightly on the framing here. Is this a funding problem or is it a capacity problem? Because you can't just pour money into a region that doesn't have the research institutions to absorb it.
That's a fair tension, and I think the honest answer is both. There's a chicken and egg dynamic where rural regions don't attract R&D investment because they lack the institutional infrastructure, and they can't build that infrastructure without the investment.
So which comes first?
Regional leaders quoted in the piece are arguing for tailored support, not just replicating urban R&D models in rural areas, but designing programs around what rural economies actually look like, which I think is the right instinct.
I'd agree with that. The innovation ecosystem in a rural agricultural region looks completely different from what's around a university anchor in a mid-sized city. You need different policy levers.
The piece doesn't go deeply into what those levers should be. It's more of a data confirmation than a policy prescription, but it's a useful data point for anyone making the case for rural R&D investment.
Okay, let's move to the Kenya piece, because I think this one's genuinely interesting.
Kenya's Tech Trends in 2026, published by Safaricom. So there's a commercial lens here, worth acknowledging. But the numbers are striking. 93% mobile money penetration. 42% of internet users using generative AI tools.
Those numbers would be remarkable in Canada. In a country where rural connectivity is still a live policy debate, they're almost hard to believe.
And the agricultural application is what I find most relevant for our audience. AI-powered agritech tools advising farmers via SMS and WhatsApp. Not apps, not dashboards, text messages.
Because that's the infrastructure that exists and that people already trust. You don't need broadband if the advice arrives in a text.
Which is a real design lesson. Rural innovation doesn't have to wait for the infrastructure gap to close. You build for what's there.
I'd add a caution, though. Safaricom is the dominant telecom in Kenya. They have a strong interest in making this story sound as good as possible. 93% penetration is the headline. What's the quality of that access? What are the costs?
That's a legitimate question, and the piece doesn't really answer it. But even discounting for the source, the SMS-based agritech model is worth studying. That kind of low bandwidth, high trust delivery is transferable.
Agreed. And it connects to something in the African business piece this week. The argument that African governments need to shift from input-driven growth to innovation-led development, with serious investment in STEM and digital literacy.
That piece is broader in scope. It's making the case that frontier technologies, AI, data systems, agritech, need to be integrated into industrial policy across the continent, not just piloted in a few urban centers.
Which rhymes with the EU conversation we just had. The challenge of getting innovation to diffuse beyond the urban core is not a European problem. It's a global one.
And the mechanism the piece is pointing to, comprehensive skills development, integration of emerging tech across agriculture and manufacturing, is more structural than a single program. It's a generational investment argument.
Which is a hard sell politically, but it's probably the right frame.
Let's stay in the news for one more item. The Philippines, the World Bank published results from the Rural Development Project, which spent about a decade shifting agricultural support away from input subsidies toward market-driven approaches.
That's a significant policy shift. Input subsidies are politically durable because farmers can see them. Market linkages are harder to explain.
Harder to explain, but the results here are interesting. The program built climate-resilient rural roads, strengthened farmer cooperatives, and used data-driven investment to identify where higher-value production was actually viable.
The roads piece matters more than it gets credit for. You can have the best cooperative structure in the world. If the road washes out every rainy season, none of it works.
Completely. And combining infrastructure investment with institutional support, the cooperatives, the market linkages, rather than doing one or the other, seems to be what drove results over that decade.
And the Brazil piece rounds out the news. Regenerative farming advancing but still under pressure from deforestation.
That's the tension Mongabay is tracking. Agribusiness drives over 90% of deforestation through cattle ranching and soy production. At the same time, programs like Reverity are aiming to restore 40 million hectares of degraded pasture land by 2030.
40 million hectares is an enormous number. For context, that's roughly the size of Germany.
And the piece is clear that without stronger policy enforcement, the restoration targets won't hold. Regenerative farming advances on one side, while the pressure on ecosystems continues on the other.
Which is the uncomfortable reality of a lot of rural innovation stories. The innovation is real. The structural pressures pushing the other direction are also real.
Let's move to organizations and events. It's a lighter week on that side.
The CRRF webinar is worth flagging again. That's the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation. The Statistics Canada Rural Data Tour was part of a webinar series they run. And if you're doing any data-heavy work on rural Canada, getting into their programming is worthwhile.
The full library at ruralinnovations.org has links to all of these. And for anyone new to CRRF, they've been one of the more consistent producers of rural research infrastructure in Canada for a long time. The Duplessis classification piece we mentioned earlier came out of their orbit.
Also worth noting, Brandon University's Journal of Rural and Community Development. That's where the tuition support paper came from. It's an open access journal, which means anyone can read it. You don't need an institutional login.
That matters. A lot of the research that's most relevant to rural practitioners is locked behind paywalls. When it's open, it's worth pointing out.
All right, let's take a breath and think about what ties this week together, because I think there's a thread running through almost everything we covered.
I was thinking about that. What's the thread you're seeing?
The gap between what's proven to work and what actually gets resourced. The EU data shows rural regions are underfunded despite population share. The Philippines' results show that when you combine infrastructure and institutional support, it works. But it took a decade in World Bank capital. The Brazil story shows regenerative models advancing against structural headwinds.
And the tuition support paper fits that frame too. You have a program that demonstrably supports rural post-secondary access, and the primary challenge is just keeping it alive financially. The model works. The resources don't follow.
Which brings me back to diffusion of innovations. Rogers would say the question isn't whether the innovation is good. The question is whether the conditions exist for it to spread.
And in rural contexts, those conditions are often missing. Not because rural communities lack ingenuity, but because the systems around them weren't designed with rural in mind. The funding structures, the data classifications, the R&D incentives.
The Kenya example cuts against that a bit, though. Mobile money in Kenya didn't wait for perfect conditions. It spread through existing infrastructure, low-tech infrastructure, and built from there.
That's fair, and I think that's actually the most useful tension to sit with. There are cases where rural communities have innovated brilliantly with what they had, and there are cases where the structural underinvestment is the binding constraint, and no amount of local creativity overcomes it.
So, the practitioner question is, which situation are you in? Because the interventions look completely different depending on the answer.
Right? And I don't think there's a clean diagnostic for that. It requires understanding the specific community, the specific sector, the specific policy environment.
Which is maybe the most honest thing we can say about rural innovation in general. Context matters more than almost any universal framework.
Although the frameworks help you ask better questions.
They help you ask better questions. That I'll grant you.
The one other thing I'd flag from this week is the Africa Piece's argument about skills. If innovation-led growth requires digital literacy and STEM capacity, then the rural education question, like the tuition support paper, isn't just a social equity issue. It's an economic development prerequisite.
You can't build a rural innovation ecosystem if the young people who could lead it don't have access to the education that makes that possible, and then they leave.
Which is the brain drain loop that rural regions everywhere are trying to break. And it's a loop that requires intervention at multiple points simultaneously: education access, economic opportunity, infrastructure, community vitality.
No single lever. That's the hard truth of it.
That's the hard truth. And it's probably why the most durable rural innovation work tends to be community-anchored and long horizon. Not a grant cycle, not a pilot project, but a genuine multi-year commitment.
The Philippines Rural Development Project ran for a decade. That's the timescale that produced results. Most of our funding cycles don't think that way.
Most of our evaluation frameworks don't think that way either, which is a problem worth naming, even if we can't solve it in 20 minutes on a Friday morning.
That's a good place to leave it. Lots to think about this week.
That's the week. The full library, every article we discussed, and the newsletter that started this whole conversation are at ruralinnovations.org.
See you next Friday.